It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Mike Messina, who comes to us from APIAVote. APIAVote, short for Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote, is the nation's leading nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to engaging, educating, and empowering Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. The goal is to strengthen their voices and their impact on public policies and legislation. For 15 years, APIAVote has been at the forefront of a rising movement to ensure AAPIs are represented and heard. This has led to historic voter turnout and advances in equity for AAPI communities. Mike Messina was a college ambassador and summer intern for APIAVote and is now the Field and Research Programs Associate. He's responsible for supporting the growth of the organization and its many programs. Mike double majored in physics and poli-sci, graduating from Binghamton University in 2021. While at Binghamton, he served as a community leader and helped organize the Bing Stop Asian Hate rally. Mike's other interests include being a filmmaker, a podcast enthusiast, and a hip-hop nerd. The title of Mike's talk is Unlocking the Power of AAPI Voters. Mike will highlight the fact that Asian American and Pacific Islander voters have proven in recent years that they are instrumental to impacting elections from coast to coast. As AAPI voter turnout and population size continue to increase, so too will AAPI electoral influence. Our conversation will explore the growing power of AAPIs as well as best practices for outreach to AAPI communities. Let's welcome today's speaker, Mike Messina.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I did not realize y'all had so much background information on me. I appreciate all of the info that y'all gave. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen here. And as we go through, if anyone has any questions, there's definitely going to be plenty of time at the end to have a pretty robust discussion with any ideas or questions that y'all might have. You can also use the chat if you have any questions that you want to jot down there for us to get back to later on. But yeah, again, thanks so much for having me. My name's Mike, Field and Research Associate at Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. So APIAVote, as we said before, the nation's leading nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to engaging, educating, and empowering Asian American and Pacific Islander communities to increase voter participation by strengthening a culture of civic engagement. And so I wanted to get into some key data points for the AAPI electorate, as well as some voting trends in just a second here. So to give you all some background information, in 2020, the AAPI community saw tremendous success as we got counted in the 2020 census. And we saw historic turnout as well for that 2020 election cycle. And since then, we've continued to see major growth in the AAPI communities, and we're one of the fastest growing populations as well. So although some states after redistricting have or rather some states in general have lost or gained total population counts, AAPI communities continue to grow in double digits over the decade in 49 of the 50 states. And after redistricting for states who lost a congressional seat, Asian population growth has prevented those states from losing even more congressional representation in the House. And here are two graphics made by our wonderful comms team to show the top states where AAPIs live. The left is by percentage, and the right graphic is by overall number. And because these are for AAPIs, as in Asian Americans, as well as Pacific Islander communities, also wanted to name the top population states for Pacific Islanders specifically by their overall numbers, which would be Hawaii, California, Washington, Texas, and Utah. And so a little bit about AAPI voter turnout. So again, like we said, historic AAPI turnout in 2020. And we know from the 2020 elections that there was a 10% increase in AAPIs who voted between 2016 and 2020. So between those election year elections, or presidential year elections, rather, with the total number of ballots cast increasing dramatically between those two. For the last 4 presidential election cycles, we could always assume that roughly half of our friends and family were registered and ready to vote. We actually finally broke that trend with 64% of our folks registered and a 60% turnout. And wanted to show a little bit of the large numbers that we had in terms of turnout in battleground states, specifically for the 2020 presidential year. Of course, we're a nonpartisan organization, so all the work that we do is geared towards the APIs overall, but we really like to show the battleground state turnout that we have, showing the dramatic impact that we can have in some of these very, very pertinent and salient elections. And so you can see on the top row here, there's this term margin of victory in that 2020 presidential election, meaning what was the difference in votes between the candidate that lost and the candidate that won in that state. And as you can see in some of these, the number of AAPIs who voted in 2020 is pretty close to, or sometimes even surpasses, that margin of victory. So in other words, the amount of AAPIs who turn out to vote in that year was even bigger than the gap that made that very crucial difference. Georgia is a state that often comes up because it was so important in determining the outcome of that 2020 election. And because if you look a little closer at the numbers, about 12,000 was that difference between winner and loser there. And the number of AAPIs turning out was 142,000. So greatly surpassing that margin of victory number many times over. And hear a little bit about the growth in AAPI voting as well. As we said before, we're continuing to grow not only in population, but also in voter registration, voter turnout, as well as vote share. And wanted to get a little bit into the AAPI voting trends. And to do so, we're going to turn to one of my favorite programs that we host here at APIAVote, in addition to these other 2 organizations mentioned in the bottom right, AAPI Data and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. We do the Asian American Voter Survey. So every other year, we host essentially the only dedicated Asian American survey going out to Asian American voters, surveying their political preferences. And so here, as a first slide, we have party identification. So that dark blue bar on the left-hand side would show the percent of the folks who responded with Democrat. The red bar right next to it is portion of folks responding Republican. Purple is independent. And then orange is other party, or folks who either don't know or don't think in terms of parties. Each one of these is broken up by a certain ethnicity. So not just Asian American in general, but Japanese, Indian, Korean, Filipino, Chinese, and Vietnamese in this case. I think this is maybe the first of many examples of the diversity that exists within the AAPI community. So when we talk about reaching out to AAPIs, that's such a broad statement. And when we're looking at outreach or surveys, anything that involves engaging the community, we really want to be specific and knowing who it is that the folks are that we're looking to reach out to, because the numbers can change and preferences can change so much from group to group. Here we have 2022 voter method, as in how did you turn out to vote? Was it in person? Was it by mail? Was it early, or was it election day? We have the dark blue on the left-hand side, in person at a polling place. And the other stat that I wanted to show and point out was how much folks have in this dark purple bar, which is by mail. We see a lot of our community taking advantage of early voting options, either going to vote early or going to vote by mail before election day. There's many different theories or potential reasons for that, but a key one is that our folks need to, or like to take the time to be able to make sure that all of their voting processes are understood and in order, which is important for a largely immigrant community, one of the largest growing immigrant communities, which is the AAPI folks. For anyone who might be limited English proficient, might need some help from friends or relatives to make sure that all of those technical materials are in place. And issue importance here, we have a whole plethora of issues that we polled folks about. The dark blue is extremely important. All the way on the right is the yellow, which is not that important. And then the dark and light purple as very or somewhat important. And you can see right in the middle bar there, we have environment with 42% of folks polled as extremely important, and then another 33% as very important. So very high numbers for AAPIs with environmental issues. I'll also say in general, and if you look online to our website or search up AAVS for Asian American Voter Survey, you'll be able to find the full report. A lot of our top issues are not too different from the issues of your average or any other groups of American voters. Healthcare, jobs, and economy are often at the top. We do have a uniquely high rate of care for environmental issues, which we'll see another data point about in a few slides, I believe. So here I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about the census data that also shows that the AAPI community tends to skew younger than the general population. The median age of the general population is 38 and a half, while it is 35 and a half for Asian Americans, and even younger, 29 and a third for Pacific Islanders. And here we have some percent voter turnout. 2020 seeing a huge jump over 2016 among Asians aged 18 to 24, from 38% turnout to almost 56% turnout. And again, Asian students as well, not just youth, showing that largest turnout increase. And so to dive in a little bit more about AAPIs and how our communities can generally relate to climate issues. Generally more likely than any other racial group to list climate change as their top issues when voting, which is a data point from Environmental Voter Project. Asian American youth that we were just talking about, especially, were 20 points more likely to name climate as one of their top issues or concerns. And to tie it into current events and current state of mind, we see a rise in different manners of climate disasters. We just saw wildfires in Hawaii and Maui. We just saw hurricanes happening on coasts, California and Florida. So it should be no surprise that climate remains a top concern for many AAPIs around the country. We're going to go through this section pretty quickly. Here's some stats on 2024 elections, where AAPIs can make a difference in presidential races coming up next year. In many of those states, where AAPIs can make a difference in Senate races, which is not a comprehensive or exhaustive list, but these are some of the first ones that we noticed. Where AAPIs can make a difference in governor's races, as well as in House races. So here's page 1 of these, page 2, and page 3. So in case anyone hails from any of these states, it would be good to take note there as well. Some competitive state ledge races. Okay. And now my favorite part, some of my favorite topics, is essentially how to engage AAPI communities best in the field, while keeping in mind that AAPI is such a diverse and broad umbrella term that there's going to be plenty of diversity within any of those communities as well. But some keys here, translated materials are key, being that nearly a third of Asian Americans have limited English proficiency, which again ties into our high immigration and immigrant population rates for AAPIs. So engaging them in their language is really crucial. And then not just translated content, but it's also important for that content to be culturally competent. So this covers everything from the photos that you use and what kind of faces are represented, making sure that languages that are provided are matching that particular community, because in addition to so many different ethnic groups, there's so many different languages and dialects of languages as well. This also means knowing when to call folks if you're doing phone banking or any other kinds of engagements. So not during church times or church days for certain communities. And all of this is really best discovered by giving a seat at the table for folks from those communities. And the very last bullet point I have that I'm going to jump to is engaging with trusted community leaders, inviting the folks from the communities that you want to engage to the table and having those deeper, meaningful one-on-one conversations with them, continuing to reach out and build that actual genuine relationship with them whenever you're running program, whenever you're going to strategically plan upcoming field plans and other engagements. These often look like folks who are at community or civic centers, could also be folks who are faith leaders in the communities as well. I'm going to jump back up to this third bullet point. So our 2022 voter survey showed nearly half of all AAPI voters received no engagement from either political party, showing us that candidates and parties need to do more to reach out to our communities if they want AAPIs to come out and vote for them. And also something that one of my colleagues pointed out is that sometimes the reason why someone isn't engaging in issues could simply be that no one ever asked them to be. And so all it takes is that first engagement to really be able to bring folks out if there's someone who hasn't ever been engaged in that way before. Voting early, like we mentioned before, APIs vote early or by mail-in ballot at a higher rate than any other racial group. So making sure these options remain available and educating our communities about the availability of these options is crucial. So keeping that in mind when crafting messaging, doing any kind of civic engagement as well. Including non-citizens with engagement options. So again, because we have such a high immigrant population, not everyone might be citizens at the time of us reaching out to them, asking them to either turn out to vote, register to vote, or call up some manner of representative that they may have. And so keeping in mind that there are plenty of ways for non-citizens to get involved in civic engagement if it's by helping those who are eligible to vote register to vote, calling your representative, of course, anyone can do, attending protests or demonstrations, getting involved in advocacy organizations or local school board meetings, and many other ways as well. So reminding our communities that voting is a tool and not an end, and that more can be and should be done to get involved if we're going to make a change together. And finally, like I said before, just to reiterate, I think the biggest takeaway point is to give a seat at the table to those community leaders who can help really inform in a real way about their own lived experiences with their own communities and how to best reach out to folks. A little bit about us and connecting with us across all these platforms at APIAVote. Also, I wrote down here, I did not make a slide for it, but I wanted to give some of the other resources as well in case y'all need some direct support whenever you're reaching out to folks. So one is the hotline that we mentioned before starting the presentation. So again, we run a multi-language Asian voter hotline. If you call 888 API vote at any point during the year, folks can leave an in-language or English voicemail for one of the folks at API Vote or our partners at AAJC to respond to. We'll also make plenty of different in-language translated graphics and toolkits for different civic holidays, like Vote Early Day, which is actually today, and many others as well. And with that, I wanted to go ahead and open up the floor to any questions that y'all might have. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here. I'm going to open chat as well.
Mike, there's a question. Well, first of all, thank you so much for that excellent presentation and for all the important work that you're doing at APIA Vote. There's a question in the chat for a couple. There's one from Debbie. For past or future voter surveys, are there questions on differences between first and second plus generations? I expect there to be at least as much difference there as there are between, or as there is between ethnicities. Plus, I assume that those who are second plus gen, the English proficiency would be different as well.
For sure. So I forget if AAVS actually does cover generations specifically in their demographic data. I do know that Pew Research Center also just did a really big push for Asian Americans there with a pretty robust survey. But that is a good question. And generational differences, I think, are another great lens to keep in mind for APIs, and I'm sure for other communities as well. I'm going to go ahead and actually search up Asian American Voter Survey, APIAVote, so I can leave y'all with a link directly to that so you can dig in for yourselves and see the many pages of questions and data that we asked for folks.
Great, thanks. Next question is from Karina. And Karina asked, I was wondering if you have demographics on how different communities vote. When I think about Latinos, for example, I know our votes differ from state to state based on the composition of different states, based on country of origin. So I wonder if you have the same challenges.
Yeah, for sure. So in that voter survey, I think we showed a little bit about it before. We showed the polled sort of stance leanings of different communities, and then we were able to disaggregate that by ethnicity. Disaggregate as in aggregating people together would just be to say Asian American in general. Disaggregating would be to say, okay, how do Japanese folks versus Indian folks versus Korean folks tend to lean? And so again, in the voter survey, we have all of that data there. We find that generally our community will lean left or lean more progressive, with the exception of Vietnamese voters who will lean a bit more conservatively or a bit more right. Yeah, of course. And, I know we went through some AAPI specific considerations, but I would also say all of the other engagement best practices also definitely apply here. Everything about making an issue relevant to a person's day-to-day life and showing them why they should be caring about it. And whenever you can, investing time and energy to building those meaningful one-on-one connections or community-to-community connections with folks.
Here's a question from Laura. She says, if this hasn't been answered yet, I saw how AAPI voters increased through the years from the graphs. So what are the factors that helps with these improvements?
That is a really good question. The $1 million question, some would say. Part of it is the grassroots organizing that folks have done. You'll see that the AAPI sort of civic engagement infrastructure is perhaps a little bit behind development wise from some other communities. And in recent years, you really saw an increase in development of that infrastructure, of folks reaching out to their own people and being able to turn folks out. We've also just had really salient, really loud, hard to ignore elections happening in these past few years, and a big change in the political landscape and political climate. And you also see sort of a momentum building. So whereas in the past, it was sort of a stereotype that AAPIs were not very engaged. And so then political campaigns, whether they be partisan or nonpartisan, don't really reach out to AAPIs. And then because we don't ask AAPIs, they don't have that benefit of the extra encouragement to turn out to vote. But now we're seeing that cycle sort of reverse, where like we saw in Georgia and many of those other battleground states, AAPIs are coming out very, very strongly. And that is going to get the attention of not only different nonpartisan and nonprofit groups, but the actual parties themselves. I think they're going to say, okay, we can't afford to lose this voting block. They're going to continue to invest time and money and attention there. And that will, in theory, and hopefully, and I believe it will continue to continue this trend of increase for AAPIs.
I'm sure that some of that increase, or a lot of that increase, can be attributed to the good work that APIAVote is doing in getting, doing voter education. But do you think, or, as you said, the sort of stereotype or the common belief used to be that Asian Americans don't get that involved politically. I wonder if you see it as a generational thing too, or but the data does look like young people in particular are getting much more politically involved. But
yeah, I think there's definitely trends, at least anecdotally, I can say, by either younger folks or higher number generations, folks who have been here for a while, who are more willing to speak up to break that model minority myth sort of stereotype, and see the importance and also the power of civic engagement. As we get better at communicating with each other, or rather with communication being more instantaneous, I think it's easier to convince folks um, to see how powerful civic engagement can be, and how powerful just calling up your representative can be if we all um, are strategic about it and are willing to do it all together, for sure. Yeah, I know someone mentioned the generational aspect as well, and that is also very important. And as we go down to more established generations, or rather higher number generations for any particular family, folks would also be more likely to be citizens, I imagine, and be able to actually exercise that right to vote. And then every generation that does that, it's also about just establishing that culture of civic engagement, because it's one thing to be registered or be eligible, and it's another thing to feel emotionally and identify with the act of voting and see it as something that you and your community really does.
there's another related question from Susan, who says your data showed that climate change is an important issue for Asian youths. Do you know if this aligns with youths in the general population?
That's a good question. I mean, I want to say that youth are generally more inclined to be passionate about climate change and climate policy in general, though I don't have hard numbers to back that up. But I feel like that pattern would bear out, just like other issue patterns that often do bear out in AAPI communities, just like any other American demographic for voters.
And I don't know if this is something that APIA vote tracks, but do you see increasing numbers of people or APIs who are, going into politics, running for office, and so on?
Yeah, and this also goes into the point we said earlier about having the actual civic engagement community infrastructure growing. Another great organization that we work with is called APACS, APAICS, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. And whereas we're an organization dedicated to getting AAPIs out to vote, APACS is largely dedicated to giving AAPIs role models and training and infrastructure to actually get out and run for office and create those pipelines from volunteer all the way up to actually running and winning seats. So yeah, we definitely see an increase there as well. And Debbie saying, or I think referring to age or generation differences, folks being involved politically, but not in American politics, just in their old country. That being true for her family, for sure, for sure. And I think if there's any manner of any number of studies that you could read in AAPI or sociology, academia, comparing folks' American political leanings and views with the political system or government or regime that they come from in terms of their home country for immigrant folks.
Thanks. Um, Are there any other questions, or people can put them in the chat, but you don't have to put them in the chat. You can also just unmute yourself and ask. Or Mike, do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, so do y'all have any particular engagements that you're doing now? And also, do y'all do any general get out the vote GOTV sort of work together?
Citizens Climate Lobby collaborates with an organization called the Environmental Voter Project, which is also a nonpartisan organization that focuses on get out the vote, and they have some method that helps them to identify people who care about the environment, but who aren't regular voters. And they try to reach out to that community with phone banks and postcards and so on, to encourage them to vote. I think there are some people in the audience here who have done quite a bit of work with EVP. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Or not? But that's, one get out the vote. And then I think CCL in some individual chapters, or I live in Michigan. I know that, Michigan CCL has organized some get out the vote activities as well. Yes, Debbie said, we volunteer with EVP. There was an awesome collaboration with EVP and APIA doing a presentation a couple of months ago. Christine Chen.
Yeah, Debbie, go on ahead. Looks like you have your hand raised.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Mike, if you haven't seen that video, I highly recommend it. It's very cool. So thank you again for coming and speaking with us. My question is kind of personal one if you want to get into it, but like I wonder, like, since working with APIAVote, if like you've had conversations with your family and how that's gone, and if you have any tips for us talking with our communities.
Yeah, for sure. So some background on myself. So I am a Korean American adoptee, which is a whole sort of Asian diasporic wave of folks. You can find Facebook groups for, or dedicated nonprofit groups for. So I was raised from within Italian households up in New York. So a very soprano sort of upbringing, if you will. And so after leaving that sort of bubble of downstate New York, and I went, as we mentioned before, to Binghamton University, which is in upstate New York. I was exposed to a very dedicated and fairly large student population there of AAPIs, which is where I really got to cut my teeth doing that community organizing there. And even now, I'm continuing to bug current undergrad and grad students there, trying to get them to be more politically involved. I think one phrase that I always hear when it comes to this kind of thing is meeting folks where they're at, and realizing that people are not going to become policy experts or super activated overnight, and that's okay. And it's our job as folks who are engaged and trying to get other folks engaged to figure out what matters to them and where those avenues for discussion are. Which often means just asking a lot of questions, not telling them what to think or not always giving your thoughts directly, but asking questions that gets them to tell you where their thoughts are, and then also asking questions to get them to think about why their thoughts are the way that they are, and to see if you can ask questions to challenge the way that they're thinking. And in terms of the nitty gritty of events, I feel like a lot of organizers know this, but just having food, having a fun vibe and community feeling for any kinds of engagements, and also reaching out to folks, not just when we need to make calls to representatives and not just when we need to be doing phone banking to voters, but throughout the year, continuing to give value and a sense of community to those folks. as best we can is the way to do it for sure.
You are totally speaking our language, or CCL calls it asking open-ended questions and engaging people and our members of Congress, and listening more than speaking.
Right. I love it. Love it. Yeah. Y'all know better than I do, I'm sure.
Motivational interviewing.
I like that. I like that.
Do you have, or I was wondering, what are some of APIAVote's activities or goals for the 2024 election, and are there ways that you could see us collaborating or helping out?
Yeah, of course. So I'm going to drop my email into the chat here, and you can feel free to send this out afterwards as well. So APIAVote is an organization that really tries to, although we're national, we try to partner really intentionally with our locally anchored partners and let them really lead because they know their communities the best. So right now we're doing a whole wave of GOTV engagement. We sent a piece of mail translated into 2 different Asian languages as well as English, and those Asian languages varied depending on where we sent them. A decision that we collaborated with our partners on. And after sending that mail to Asian voters across the country, we're also following that up with phone calls and sometimes text messages as well. So recruiting volunteers to help make all of those calls is a really big push for us right now, as well as getting folks, especially anyone with Asian language capability, to help us out with our voter hotline, to be able to answer calls from folks who get that mailer and see the hotline written on it and then say, okay, I do have a question. Let's take advantage of this and call. And these are often folks who have that language need, who can't really navigate the technical language of the Secretary of State websites, for example, and really need that one-to-one help. So any manner of help recruiting there would be very much appreciated. And also us helping y'all get any kind of either digital or translated resources that you may need if you're interested in getting your folks engaged for this election season to either register or to get out to vote. And how many people do we try to reach? That's a good question. Several 100,000 this year. We sent out about, I think, 1.5 million pieces of mail last year in the midterm. So I imagine more than that next year in the presidential 2024 election. And then the hotline reaches, I'd say, a few hundred every year, depending on what the demand is, sometimes depending on how strict or how different, how many changes have been made to election laws to folks.
Great, thanks. Are there other questions? If not, then I have a request. Could we take a group photograph with Mike, and I'd like to share that with the folks at APIAVote? Would people mind doing that?
I'm okay with that.
Great. Okay. Is everyone who wants their camera on ready? Great. Thank you. I guess if there aren't any more questions, and Mike, if you don't have any other questions for us, maybe we can just thank Mike for his very informative, excellent talk, and say good night.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, y'all. Again, my email's there, so feel free to reach out. And I'm also going to link to our volunteer page for those phone, text, and hotline opportunities. And if y'all need help translating or getting any advice for AAPI outreach, please go ahead and reach out to us.